Hi, Nathaniel. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, how you going?
Good. We're so glad you're here for take two, for round two, we should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so glad to have you back. And we're going to jump right in to talk about some things in your new book about the science of learning.
Thank you.
And
it's so exciting.
I know, it's so exciting that you have a new book. And one thing we wanted to ask you about with the science of learning, I know, we talk about the science of reading. The science of reading is everywhere. Everyone's talking about it. But I keep hearing the science of learning kind of creep up in more and more conversations. And we just want to make sure, before we even jump into it, what is it? What is the science of learning? What does that term mean?
So it's a really interesting term that's being used a lot around the world at the moment. It's starting to grow in more prominence, like the science of reading has a lot of prominence. It is really a broad body of knowledge, and like the science of reading, it comes from lots of different fields and lots of different studies, thousands and thousands of research studies that have been conducted over the last at least 50 years, if not much longer. And it's a growing consensus about some of the principles about how learning happens, how best to teach, and it includes all subjects and all sort of learning areas. So broadly, it's science of learning and development, but particularly for the classroom sort of work, it basically is the overarching body of research that explains why the science of reading and also the science of maths, for example, sort of works and has general principles that can be applied to any subject.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. I would assume that some of the things in the science of learning either overlap or kind of go together with the science of reading. And is that true?
Yeah, so in the science of reading, there's obviously a big focus on explicitly teaching the code and explicitly teaching phoneme grapheme correspondences and helping students to make connections between all the other parts of the reading rope, if you want to use that metaphor. So vocabulary, morphology, and sentence structure and comprehension strategies, all those things. So the science of learning essentially has very similar principles and principles that also emphasize the importance of explicitly teaching things, but also the importance of retrieval practice, of giving students spacing and interleaving in the practice that they receive, and also in the level of responsiveness that you need as an educator when you're dealing with new content and new information that we haven't actually evolved to learn. So reading is a great example of something that is relatively new in our evolutionary history, but mathematics, history and science and geography, all of these other bodies of knowledge and skill sets are actually relatively new as well, and as a result they lend themselves to much more explicit modeling, guidance and practice that's intentional by the teacher. So really the science of learning is just a way of thinking about all the choices that you could make as a teacher and which principles and practices will best support the most amount of learners in the most efficient way possible, because that instructional time really does matter.
I love that definition. It's perfect.
Yeah, I don't know what teacher would not want to maximize their instructional time with the science of learning.
It sounds pretty good, right? It's a good selling point, but yeah, it's sort of digging deeper. You probably want to know more information, hence why I think having more resources out there that help to demystify, I think are really helpful.
Okay, so I think we want to give our teacher friends listening some really practical takeaways from your book. And in one chapter, you discuss some mindset shifts based on science of learning, and I thought it would be a good idea to walk through some together. So I'm going to pull out 3 and list them, and then we can go back and talk about each one if that sounds good.
Sounds great.
Okay, so the first mindset shift is make effective and engaging teaching the norm. The second is plan curriculum that is coherent, knowledge-rich, and includes regular review. The third is teach at the whole class level responsibly. So let's go back to that first one, make effective and engaging teaching the norm. What does this mean and how do we do this? And if you can answer this question, I feel like you get $1 million because this is huge.
So effective and engaging, I think one of the biggest things that I try and unpack in this volume, which I've been so lucky to put together, it's a collaborative project with a lot of other co-authors, and you'd see a list of those if you jump on the website and have a look. Great people that have actually been on this podcast as well, for example, Professor Pamela Snow and others. And it's also a way of capturing great practice from schools as well. And these schools that have showcased how they've utilized the science of learning in their practice really have changed the definition of what engaging means. And I think engaging has lots of different meanings, but the most useful one for us as educators is one that links back to engagement in learning and engagement in things that make you feel successful. And so I try and really unpack in in this particular section of the book that engaging teaching is really about helping students experience that success, to feel supported, and having that motivation come from that focus on, oh wow, I could do something I couldn't do before. So when you make engaging and effective teaching the norm, you're basically ensuring that those good feelings and those great successes happen win after win after win every day, and that the way that you've actually structured your teaching sets everyone up for success, not for failure. There's actually a lot of competing ideas at the moment that say that struggle, and even productive struggle, is a good thing, and we want students to get in there and feel uncomfortable. And I'm not saying that that's unavoidable in the learning process, but certainly with complex skills and with things that are biologically secondary, that is not acquired naturally, it doesn't make sense for us to make it intentionally harder for our students to master those skills. So by this first sort of mind shift really is about knowing exactly what you're trying to teach, breaking it down into manageable chunks and ensuring it links together with students' prior knowledge, and therefore making it really effective, but also therefore really engaging, because there's that sense of success. The other thing that improves engagement, rather than the best GIF, or the fantastic fonts, or the fancy graphics and posters around the room, something that really helps students feel engaged in their learning is ensuring that there's no time to feel anything else but that excitement and challenge. So having routines and having quick transitions and having pacey, what you call perky pace in the US, but we might just call pacey because perky is a funny word in Australia for some reason. Having that pace that is really exciting, and that teachers know when it's fallen apart because, I've struggled to find my next resource, or I can't get this thing to load, or you suddenly get those little sort of sounds in the corner, or kids starting to sort of muck around or play with their mini whiteboards. Ensuring that those moments are as minimal as possible, and that you are literally on the ball every single second of your lesson when you're doing all of that explicit teaching. That essentially makes it a normal thing for students to feel engaged, to feel challenged, but also to feel really supported, and ensuring that every single minute does really count, and it builds towards that growing independence. So they really need you at the front end when you're explicitly modeling and demonstrating, you're practicing, you're checking for understanding, and that over time you're wanting students to move into that more independence. They're not going to get there if half the explicit teaching time they're sort of waiting for you to do the next thing, or they're waiting for their partner to remember what's next in the routine, or they're waiting in line to pick up their mini whiteboard or whiteboard marker because it's in the back of the room and it's inefficient to get it out. So that's really what that principle is about, is just make every day a day that has the maximum amount of learning possible, and then it's engaging, but it's also really, really effective and efficient.
Okay, so you've mentioned a couple times, and I love the use of the mini whiteboards, but you've mentioned that in this explanation. I'm wondering if there's anything you want to elaborate on. I know we just talked about effective engaging. We're using a lot of keywords. Would you like to elaborate on anything, like how can we use those whiteboards to be effective and engaging? Because I think they're incredible tools. I mean, I use them all the way through when I taught high school. And I just think it's a great way to make what's in kids' brains visual. But I'd love to hear from you.
So a few of my colleagues, I'm going to name one of them who's a co-author on the mathematics chapter. He says that he could teach a group of children in a desert as long as he had mini whiteboards. That these are really powerful, low tech and very low cost tools that we should be using routinely in our classrooms for things like spelling, obviously, for writing, but also for responding to multiple choice questions, for completing sentence starters about content and rich sort of questions that we're engaging with in the lesson, for all kinds of things we could be doing. The reason they're so useful is because they take what's inside students' heads and they represent what might be going on a way that we can actually see. And they therefore give you a window into whether your teaching is working or not. So if anything, the checking for understanding is one of those big themes and big ideas that I tackle in the book, because it's, the evidence and the science of the learning really points to we need to know what's going on with our students in real time, not just at the end of the lesson or the end of the test. So the mini whiteboard is just one really, really powerful way that you can do it. I know some teachers shy away from them. It's annoying to get them out. The kids play with them. They start doodling. They cause issues. There's fights about them. Essentially, what we want to do is treat the setup of the routine like a mini whiteboard as just as much importance as the use of them down the track. So we actually need to invest time and explicit instruction and modeling and rehearsal in how those routines are going to work. And my routines are completely like structured, and there's no sort of question of what to do with your whiteboard when. There's always a thing that's waiting for you to do the next thing. So there's chin it, and everyone says chin it at the same time. There's park your board, clear your board. You've got 5 seconds. Show me your hands. All of these things that sort of make it easier for students to know what's right and what's expected, so that those tools don't become a hindrance but become a real helper for the learning that's going to happen. And that's why I bang on and on about mini whiteboards, but they are just so useful. And rather than relying on remembering what your partner has said, you can look at your partner's answer and discuss it. It becomes a mini artifact you can use to increase the amount of rigor of thinking and participation within your classroom, the way Doug Lemov talks about thinking and participation ratio. This is a big way that you can make it sort of happen. So hence, if mini whiteboards become part of your regular diet of instructional choices, you're going to make engaging and effective teaching the norm in your classroom.
I have to say my son loves a mini whiteboard. Just last night we were doing a math workbook that for a kindergartner, it was not that exciting. But then he goes, "Can we do some real math on the whiteboard?" I was like, "Yeah, let's do some real math on the whiteboard." So it is inherently engaging for kids, I think, too.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's real benefits to helping them feel that, it's about making mistakes as well as getting things right. Like it's okay, it's low stakes. That's a really important part of helping students to feel comfortable. Because I know there's many kids progressing through elementary and middle school never having to answer a question in front of their peers. And this is a way that they can do it, as well as I'm a big fan of cold call as well, but this is a way that they can do it where it's this low stakes. No one has to look at what your answer is, but the teacher needs to know, which is the most important thing.
Such a good point. And it just these little mini assessments, I'm thinking every couple minutes, right? Every minute, every couple minutes in your classroom that you can use to know where your kids are. And every single subject, every single task. It doesn't have to, it's kind of limitless. I love this. Yeah. Okay. So that's such a practical tip. So if you're one of our teacher friends listening, you don't have a mini whiteboard for your students,
you got to get them.
Highly recommend. You got to get it. And we use like I've used socks, right? For
you can use whatever
erasers.
To wipe them.
Just so easy. Yeah. Okay. Love this practical stuff. All right. So the second mindset shift I want to go back to is plan curriculum that is coherent, knowledge rich, and includes regular review. So I want to dig into this because I think there are so many nuances here. I'm so curious, especially about the regular review part. But I also think I want to make sure we speak to the fact that teachers may not have a say in the curriculum that is chosen or that they're using. So I'll leave it to you, Nathaniel.
So it is a tricky one. I think in some jurisdictions, there is a lot more choice that educators can make. So it means that if the curriculum's not working, it's their problem. In other jurisdictions, like in many districts in the US, that's a district level decision. So there's not as much nuance there. So depending on how you're coming at this, any way that you can improve the coherence, the way that the lessons, but also the units or the sequences of learning connect with each other and the way that they support each other, the better. So what you're doing in reading should actually connect with what you're doing in writing. You should be able to write about interesting topics that you've been reading about. You should be able to bring lots of sentence level work into the reading sort of space, so that even if your focus is a novel or your focus is on a rich text, you are still writing about it and you're using those writing skills in real time. The other coherence level might be how things from history and science and geography actually connect to each other, and you can show how something that we've learnt last year actually builds and connects to this new topic now, because none of these disciplines exist in a silo. There are logical distinctions between them, and I talk about that in this knowledge-rich curriculum chapter with Reed Smith, who's the leader of Ochre Education, a set of free resources in Australia, which are really, really widely used here. We talk about knowledge-rich curriculum because of just how important that knowledge is for building up students' understanding and seeing those connections. But coherence is the other part of that chapter, is that you can't just throw facts at students and sort of hope that they stick. You need to help see the bigger ideas and the bigger connections, and having things like advanced organizers that show how all the knowledge within a unit or sequence of lessons is meant to fit together, or the big ideas within a particular novel or text, and helping students to make that sort of click for them. There's this great theory that I mention in the book, and I'd love to write more about it, but it's called meaningful learning theory by Ojibel is the the theorist. I never know how to pronounce his name, so forgive me if I've said that wrong. But he invented advanced organizers and also had this idea that you have to connect what students are learning now to what they've learned previously. If it doesn't connect and if it doesn't cohere, that means sort of stick together, then there's no point really teaching it. Because the other part of this principle is that we have to use regular review because of something called the forgetting curve. 90% of things that we teach actually get forgotten. And it's like so depressing.
It is really depressing.
Really sad.
To know that 90% of your time is potentially wasted. But the thing that doesn't make it wasted and the things that ensures that it does stick better is things like retrieval practice, using regular review, using spacing and interleaving. So you're not just cramming a whole subject into a 2-week intensive. You actually have time to build up students' understanding over a longer period, and then allowing them to start to forget before you ask them to remember again. So that coherence, the knowledge rich, and the review really does help the curriculum come to life. And if you've got a strict curriculum that you have to stick to that you're not a big fan of, one way that you can improve it is by showing what those connections are, actively connecting things that you're teaching to what you've taught before, adding those bits in, but also including regular daily retrieval practice so that students can actually be forced to try and retrieve what they've learned weeks and months before, and even the day before as well in the initial stages. And this has a huge power. I talk about lots of case studies of schools that have seen huge shift just because of improving their retrieval practice, and that's all that they've done. And that can be a big game changer and doesn't require you to choose a new curriculum. It's just using the best available resources you have and spacing that sort of practice out over time and giving students lots of chances to start to forget and then be tested to see if they remember. That self-testing effect is really what retrieval practice is.
And I'm hearing with the coherence that it doesn't have to be that they're learning it at the same time, because I know we hear that a lot is like, well, if they're reading a book about the Revolutionary War, then they should be learning that same thing in social studies at the same exact time. But I heard you kind of say...
Exactly.
Doesn't have
it's
to
actually
happen that
some
way.
benefit to not doing it at the same time, because you are then revisiting that learning in a new context and you're also having to retrieve the things that you've learned. I think we don't often bring out materials or bring out things from previous units of work from 6 months ago enough with students. I think we assume that we've taught it, we've moved on to the next semester, like let's just forget about all that other stuff. But that's how we actually allow the forgetting curve to plague our work as teachers. If we are not so fussy about having to do things simultaneously because there's actual benefit to spacing and interleaving, going back and forth between topics, then we can really take a load off ourselves and not put that pressure on in terms of scheduling, and also take advantage of that benefit of spacing and interleaving. These are big benefits and big effects. I know that everyone probably remembers cramming for an exam the night before and feeling like on the exam you did pretty well, and you might have, but you ask yourself 2 weeks later if you remember much of what you've crammed over that one intensive practice session. Probably not much at all. But if you space that learning out over many months, over many weeks ideally, and continue coming back to it year after year in relevant, meaningful ways, then that learning is going to stick forever. That's why we tend to, that old saying of use it or lose it is still very true. If you don't use that old information or content or learning or skills, it does disappear. That's one of the challenges that we have as educators and as learners ourselves too.
So good. I love this idea of allowing them to start to forget before they remember again. I'm going to put that somewhere in my office. I love that.
It's counterintuitive, isn't it? But
it
it's
really
helpful.
is. It really is. I love it. I mean, it's just brilliant. I'm wondering if you could just chat a bit about the advanced organizers. I feel like that's caught my attention when you mentioned it, and I want to make sure we chat about that before we move on to the final mindset shift.
Sure. So advanced organizers, as I said, were invented by Ojibel, Meaningful Learning Theory. There's a great book on meaningful learning theory that's really accessible. It's one of the in-action series that have been put together. There's one on cognitive load. This is one on meaningful learning theory. So I referenced this in the book, and I find it really, really helpful for getting into this conversation. And it's sort of intuitive ideas that you don't want to teach something that has no relevance and no connection point to previous learning or previous experience. But if you don't consciously make a decision to connect it and to show how it connects and do that in a coherent way, then it's really easy for students to just be like, oh, that obviously wasn't important. I'm just going to disregard that. And they might even just do that subconsciously. It might not even be a malicious thing where they're trying to forget all the great things you've taught them. It's just, the brain has to prune stuff, and it's going to prune the things that it thinks aren't relevant. So advanced organizers basically give you like a 1 one-pager of what the whole unit of work is going to look like. So if it's a novel study, it'll talk about, it'll have key sort of characters and very brief descriptions of who they are. It might have a character map that shows how they connect to each other. It'll have key events, maybe key themes, essentially like all the meaty but high level sort of stuff that you hope students to gain from that unit of work or sequence of lessons. And it'll look different in different subjects, but ideally, students are actively engaging with this material as well. They look at it before the unit begins and it's sort of introduction. You might introduce it progressively, so you show one subtopic and then keep adding to it until it becomes a one-pager. I've seen teachers sort of chop it up and sort of allow one piece to be added at a time so that they don't get overwhelmed by looking at the whole page at one time. But then you have retrieval practice exercises based on that knowledge organizer. So you cover up the key terms and you leave the descriptions and see if they can retrieve what the key terms were and do the reverse. And all kinds of other things, create flashcards with the same information. Essentially, building up as many opportunities for students to get that core content and core learning from any one sequence of lessons that you're doing.
That's so neat. I like that. I feel like you could use that for any content, yes? Like you could be, I'm picturing, I have a 7th grader and she's learning about the medieval time period. I'm imagining that I could
it would be perfect for that.
Do that for that, and then be helping her, with the different terms, because there's so many that are used interchangeably. There's a lot of morphology that comes into play there about the history of language and the different roles and of people in society. Okay, so you could do it with any content.
Definitely, and I think in terms of more skills-based content, it would look more like a sort of an overview, or like almost like a student-friendly version of a scope and sequence. But it's the kind of thing that some people might represent on a poster, or they might put around the room. But when it is something that students actively engage with and maybe have to do retrieval practice with, that's when it becomes a bit more useful. I haven't seen it used in the early phonics sort of space as much, but it probably does lend itself more to sort of content that's vocabulary and sort of morphology and sort of facts and dates and key concepts and ideas and connections. But with the example of medieval history, it's perfect because you can get a brief look at what the whole unit is meant to cover, how things are meant to fit together. And when you delve into a topic on, Anne Boleyn, for example, and you're looking at that particular figure in history, you know where that fits in. You might have a timeline, for example, with history that shows some basic dates that allows you to plot what you're learning about in time and in relevance according to the unit. I think some schools have experimented with this in the UK quite a bit, and some have probably gone over the top with how much they've used it. So I think there's some learning to be had by looking at some of the blog posts from the UK where they've been bringing in knowledge organisers, refining them, potentially cutting them back a little bit, but essentially finding the right balance there.
So neat. I love thinking about that as like a little. I'm just thinking about it right now as a personal anchor chart, right? It's helping me anchor myself into the content and kind of situate before we even begin. And instead of just my teacher taking me on this journey, I can situate where things fall and where characters in a story might land if they lived, if I'm reading a fictional story about the time where they might be, or if I'm reading realistic, stuff, they obviously would situate in history. So that's so cool. Thank you for that explanation.
That's a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay, so on to Mindset Shift 3, teach at the whole class level responsively. I feel like this is just bringing together all the things we just talked about, but I want to ask, what does this look like in practice?
So I've spoken a bit about this, and I've been releasing some blog posts that sort of communicate some of my thinking that does come through in the book. I think this is a space where the evidence as I look at it now in the science of learning does point to the fact that if you're teaching something for the first time, it doesn't make sense to break that instruction into 5 different groups. I think when you're teaching something for the first time and you're doing that in a way that automatically connects to what students have learned before, because, a part of that coherent knowledge that we just talked about, then you should be able to do that initial instruction as a group together. That doesn't mean, I think this is where the myths about explicit instruction come in, that doesn't mean that you're just lecturing at students. It doesn't mean that you're making them sit there and just digest information and do stuff randomly. And it doesn't mean that you're just hoping for the best and sort of delivering information and not knowing if it's going to work. It is possible to teach at the whole class level in a more responsive way than we're probably used to seeing. I think when we think of whole class, we might think of the mini lesson as in the guided reading and balanced literacy sort of era. And a mini lesson My problem is that it's basically an intensive lecture. So it's 5 minutes of the teacher lecturing, because the belief is that the learning will actually happen when they go off and do it themselves. But here, I think there's a real point to saying that if we break our instruction down into manageable chunks, if we consciously model and explain and show the things that we're wanting students to master, we can do that in a gradual sort of fashion. And that gradual release of responsibility can essentially happen at that whole group level. What this might mean in practice is that you are obviously explaining, modeling, showing, but you're then checking for understanding constantly. So you're using the mini whiteboards, you're using pair shares, you're using cold calls, you're getting that responsiveness in your class, you're using something that Craig Barton from the UK calls checks for listening, where you're just breaking up your instruction with little checks, being like, so what did I say, Laurie? What was that one, Melissa? Can you tell me this one again, Laurie? And you basically ensuring that students are still with you.
So much
I
pressure.
love that. So much pressure. But I mean, if kids are used to it, then
If
it's
they're used to it,
like you
it's
said, it's
actually
a
a real game
routine.
changer. And
Yeah.
you can do it whole class as well. So you can, those closed sentences you find yourself doing. So a morpheme is the smallest unit of, and you get everyone to say meaning. And
Yeah.
so you then start saying a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. What is it, Melissa?
Meaning.
And then you just get them to repeat that bit. Yeah, she did it beautifully. Look, it's not a
No
stressful
pressure at
thing
all.
at all. But there's obviously that's the presentation side of things. In terms of the responsiveness, the most important thing about checking for understanding is what you then do with it. So you could be observing things on mini whiteboards as students are completing a sentence prompt or they're answering a question. And what you can do then and there is the differentiation. So I go to my students and I strategically place them in the room so it's easier to spend more time with them. And I give them, I see what they're doing, and I potentially give them a question or a follow-up prompt, or repeat some of the instructions so that they've got a chance to hear it again. Because I know that I'm going to need to give more of myself and more of my time and energy to those students who need me more. There's obviously diversity within every classroom, and you're going to have students that are able to do things more independently and others that are just going to need you more. You could fix that problem by creating 3 or 4 different groups and sort of teaching them differently. The problem that I think that causes, and I think that we really need to interrogate both in a research-based way but also a practice-based way as we start to nut out the best possible ways to move forward, is that we don't want to lock students into that trajectory. If they're in the low group, you don't want them to stay in the low group. And I think if you think critically about your own practice, you might sort of realize that kids that were in the low group in kindergarten were probably in the low group in year 1 and year 2 as well. It's just how things tend to go. But I've seen the opposite happen when we've taught at a whole class instruction level, where there's teachers teaching dynamically, engagingly, responsively, there's checking for understanding, there's lots of modeling, they're connecting it to prior learning, they're giving lots and lots of chances to respond. And they get lots of extra support for those students who need it in the moment. I always give bonus words and bonus sentences and, ask students to apply things further if I need to buy myself some time to work with my 5 students who are closer to the front of the room. So those students will challenge themselves on the next part of the task. Or you have one half of the class of the slide that you're showing for the task or on the board that says the standard task, and then you've got the extension sort of challenge task or super challenge task on the board already. So students know once they finish that first one, they keep going. And you can then work with that sort of group or that whoever's needing that trouble. You don't need to define the groups in the moment. That's the best thing. You can just work with whoever is needing you right then and there. You can then go and support them on the base level example, because that's what you want everyone to be able to achieve. So I know I'm going into my whole class teacher rant here, and sort of just stop me when I get too over the top. But I think this is something that really I think is exciting to interrogate, and something that I've really tried to capture from the schools that I included in this book as well. They talk about finding their profession again and feeling like they can be a really good instructor and not just a facilitator of different stations. And I think this is something really cool about what the science of learning is pointing to, is that we need to be really, really good educators and make great in the moment decisions beforehand, and great planning decisions in the moment decisions then, and then planning decisions beforehand. And this would help every instructional minute actually count, rather than having that dead time or that perfect non-example of what I've been talking about, where teachers are teaching the same thing to 5 or 6 different students in a row when they're doing that individual work. It's like, why did you need to teach it 5 times? Just bring that group back together and teach it again. If they need that additional, that extra instruction after the initial, just provide it in the moment when they need it.
I'm curious about, small group instruction is something that I would say, especially elementary teachers, primary teachers, it is a part of their instruction for a lot of them. And I'm just wondering, especially when they're teaching foundational skills, I would say, do you think there is any place for small group instruction, or do you think, what you described is the way to go?
So what I say really carefully and cautiously in the book is that I'm not saying not to use small group instruction. What I really am trying to get across is that when you can teach the whole class, teach the whole class. When you need to do that follow-up instruction because the first dose didn't work, obviously run the small group. Ideally, you do it during reading fluency pairs or when students are doing something meaningful and you're not sort of having to create those arbitrary sort of stations that don't necessarily add up to a good use of their time. So, or they're doing the task that they would have been doing independently anyway. And you've got 15 minutes where students are meant to be independent because they've just done the explicit lesson. And that makes sense to take that group then and work for 15 minutes intensively and in a really responsive sort of way. So I think just reshifting when the small group instruction happens and for what purpose is really getting the best of both worlds. The other thing about small group is that it should occur as part of a multi-tiered systems of support. We can't expect the classroom teacher who's one person with a group of 25 or 30 to be able to provide the tier 2 and the tier 3 intervention. That really should be additional resources that your school provides. And it's obviously difficult depending on your circumstances to guarantee that, but you can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem. So if your initial instruction isn't on grade level, it isn't challenging enough, and it isn't maybe responsive and effective enough because you're breaking it up into 5 different mini lessons with 5 different groups, then there's no way that you're going to solve that sort of tier 3 sort of issue because you're not giving that first instruction to everyone to give them the chance of sort of catching up. I think if we went harder and a little bit more responsive and a little bit more vigilant with our kindergarten students when we first get them and say, well, we're just going to jump into this instruction and give it a go. We're going to learn these codes and we're going to get them saying the sounds. We're going to get them jumping up and getting excited about words and syllables and actually feeling that this is a useful time to try and minimize those gaps. Then we'd actually have a situation where halfway through kindergarten, there isn't a huge gap between students because they've all had that initial instruction at the same time. And you've actually started applying some of that extra support from the get-go. And I think it would resolve many of the challenges we see in year 2 and grade 3 and grade 4, where the gaps are just so big. Like, what do you do with those gaps by the time it's that large? They're not nearly as big in kindergarten and in year 1. There's something you can really do really well and do really effectively with that opportunity. It's not necessarily a challenge if you say, well, this gap could be closed now, or we could just leave it to continue widening as students progress through the school years, which is basically what happens now because of, these practices aren't well utilized, and the principles of the science of reading, let alone the science of learning, are still finding their way into a lot of these places, which would ultimately improve the instruction and the intervention.
Yeah, we've actually talked with a group of kindergarten teachers who help us illuminate that kindergarten. One of our most popular episodes in the very beginning of our podcast was a kindergarten teacher reaches 100%, for her whole class in her data, and it's exactly what you said.
Yeah,
she shifted to using.
Like, I've done my job really well. I've used this time as well as I could. Yeah.
Yeah, and then she was able to get her team on board, and so we did a podcast with them as well. We'll link them in the show notes if anybody wants to hear as an example, I think, of what you're talking about, right? Closing that gap really early on. And, just to be mindful that we know there are a lot of teachers listening who are not kindergarten teachers. So,
and your work is going to be more complicated.
Correct.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, this was just a taste of what is in your book, and we don't have your book yet, but this made me really excited.
I
cannot wait. But for everyone out
number
there,
of days,
I know.
Yeah.
By the time this comes out, it will be much closer, if not already out. So people listening, you can learn more about Nathaniel and his new book, Harnessing the Science of Learning, at his website, nathanielswain.com. And of course, you can find the book at Amazon or probably wherever you buy books.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great chance to catch up as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. This was so much fun, so awesome, and so engaging and effective.
That's the whole goal, isn't it?